first I'm going to orient us to the website as to where you will find this resource and how to subscribe. And I'm going to show you a couple of sample pages from the PDF, and I'll show you a sample e-blast. And so it shouldn't take too long, but just to kind of get us thinking about how this is going to manifest itself. So let's just start with the website. So I think, does everybody see the where it says the Birth of Hope? Great, thank you, Suzanne. So I'm just going to go back to the homepage of the website and help you navigate in. So this is pwrdf.org, and across the top of our purple navigational bar, it does say Get Involved. So you can click on Get Involved, and then these kinds of resources, because they're designed for individuals, are usually parked in PWRDF at home. But if you can't remember that, it does say Seasonal Reflections. And so you click on here, and this is where we've got our Praying with PWRDF, our Education Focus, other resources, Seasonal Resources. And it says Advent 2022, the Birth of Hope. And then we're going to click on Learn More and Subscribe. Now, so that's just one way. The other way is just to go to, if you can see the URL up here, pwrdf.org/Advent 2022. You don't have to do all that other stuff, but in case, so I like to give people different options of how to find things. So, but you can just go to Advent 2022. So we have a landing page here with a lovely picture of Dr. Keesmaat and a little description of sort of an intro, very brief intro. And then you'll see here where you can subscribe to receive the daily emails. We've been doing it this way for about 5 years now, and it's been a really effective way. Last year, almost 1,000 people subscribed to our Advent resource. And so it brings in new people. It also really, I mean, I think it's just a lovely way to prepare for Christmas. It's really part of my own personal Advent tradition, and I assume yours as well, and that's why you're here. So that's wonderful. So you just fill in your email address, your first name and your last name, and click on the purple bar to sign up today. And then you will start to receive e-blasts. I'm going to say November the 27th, which is the first Sunday of Advent, but actually we will probably send one out. Our practice is to send one out the day before, just to kind of sort of introduce it, remind you that you've subscribed, work out some of the glitches that a lot of times when you sign up to an online subscription base, it might go into your junk folder at first. So this gives you a chance to just make sure that you've told your email server that this is not junk. So that's the other thing here is it says, right, you can see here, the PDF will be available for download by November 7th. What date did I commit myself to here? Next Monday. Well, it's probably going to be more like the 9th, next Wednesday, but we are working very hard to get it out in advance, because we know that some people like to see the entire resource if they're going to use it as a basis of a Bible study. And Dr. Keesmaat is going to elaborate on that, but we actually, because we know that some people like to use it in a group, like whether it's a, you know, quote unquote Bible study or not, we have got every week there are some Bible study questions that will be included in the resource and also included in the e-blast. So it's a little bit of a different, you know, additional offering this year. So I'm just going to go back to show you a couple more brief things before we turn the stage over to Dr. Keesmaat. And so here's a sample of how the e-blast will look. And we've got each day is divided into read, reflect, and pray. And so Dr. Keesmaat has selected, again, she's going to go into more of this, but there's a scripture verse, a reflection, and a prayer at the bottom. And so I'm going to just show you one more thing before we move on. Hopefully I will be able to share this more readily. Okay, so here is a sample, very clean design, just so that if you do want to print it out, you're not going to be using a lot of ink. So for example, this is a Tuesday, November 29th. It was the same day that I showed you in the e-blast. And oh, what I forgot to do in the e-blast, but I'll just show you here, is that for every day when we have the read, reflect, and pray, there's also a link to a PWRDF story, so that we're really connecting the themes of Advent and the themes that Sylvia has pulled out to the work of our partners. So at the end of each week, there are some questions that relate back to all the readings and the reflections that you've read for the week. And so that's just a simple page that's included in the entire PDF, and it will also be, it will also form the Saturday e-blast. Do you want to say a few words, Suzanne, to introduce Dr. Keesmaat?
Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat, a renowned biblical scholar. Dr. Keesmaat is the co-chair of the Bishop's Committee on Creation Care for the Diocese of Toronto. She teaches online at Bible Remixed and part-time at Trinity College in the Toronto School of Theology. Sylvia is the co-author with Brian Walsh of Romans Disarmed, Resisting Empire, Demanding Justice. She speaks frequently on topics related to the Bible and economic justice, climate catastrophe, gender justice, and Indigenous justice. She lives at Russet House Farm, an off-grid permaculture farm in the Kawartha Lakes region of Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Michi-Saagiig Nashnabeg. With her husband, Brian Walsh, and a fluctuating number of people and animals. And just on a personal note, Sylvia was my first professor when I began my Master's of Theological Studies program 7 years ago. I'm almost finished, and it was thanks to Sylvia's inspiration that I, that I kept going. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us, Sylvia, and a wonderful privilege to have you as the writer of our Advent resource. So please be welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. I'm delighted to be here. I still remember you in that class so long ago, 7 years. It doesn't seem like that's possible. And it's nice to see so many familiar faces here on this call as well. So I'm going to do a couple things here. I'm going to say something in general about the Advent reflections and how they kind of came together. I'm going to walk you through and just essentially read one reflection with you. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Bible study, just to give you an overview of what these 4 Advent weeks will look like and different ways that, or the way, or suggestions for ways you can use them. So these Advent reflections began with this question: how does the biblical story connect with the challenges, griefs, and hopes of our time, especially the climate crisis? Because the topic is women in the climate crisis that I was asked to write about. Now, one way to answer that question, this question of how things connect, is to say that the biblical text gives us examples of people who've had faith, who've trusted God no matter what. We all know that that's not a great way to make connections with the biblical text, because some of the examples of the people in the text are not great examples. If you've taught Sunday school, you know what I'm talking about here. It's some of these stories are hard to draw those connections. Another way to answer this question of how the Bible connects to our current situation is to say that the Bible gives us commands for how to live, and if we follow those, we'll be doing God's will. The problem with that one is if the text doesn't actually overtly address a lot of the things we're struggling with now today. So there's a lot of translation that has to happen. So what if instead of a book of not very good examples, or instead of a book of slightly archaic rules, what if this book tells us something about who our God is and who we are called to be, and does so by calling us into a story that shows us who God is, that calls us into relationship with this God, that invites us into this relationship, that says essentially, there's a role here for you too, if you want it. So that's the first thing these reflections do. They tell the story, a story that invites us into life with God and each other. So that's the kind of the overarching reach of what I wanted to do, sort of say, look, this is the story of who God is. This is how other people have responded to God in this story. And what would it look like for us to enter into that story as well? The second thing these reflections do is to draw some clear connections between the social and the economic situation of the biblical text and our own time. I mean, it's become a bit of a truism to say things like, well, the Bible's an ancient text that doesn't address the kinds of issues we're grappling with today. I mean, I heard this a lot when I was in graduate school and in undergraduate too. And that might be true about some things, but in other ways, there are striking parallels. I mean, it's true that, the Bible isn't going to give us guidelines on, how much time we should spend on the computer or whether we should have a dishwasher, though actually I think the Bible does say things that help us discern that. But there are some larger parallels between how we live today and how people lived in the ancient world. And there are stories that highlight those parables, that highlight those parallels, that highlight the things we read about in the paper or online today. So there are stories about drought and famine, right? There's been a lot about that recently. There are stories about a flood, and there's been a lot about floods lately. There are stories about climate refugees, about women who were homeless and were dumpster diving, which is essentially the modern equivalent of gleaning, right? If you think, I think when we tell the story of Ruth, which is in these 4 weeks, we tend to have a kind of a romantic vision of what gleaning was like, but it was essentially the ancient equivalent of dumpster diving. You might get enough to eat, you might not. There are stories about people who oppress others by controlling the flow of goods. We see that happening in the world today. There are those who lose everything due to sickness. And there are stories about how a walk can result in singing and hope. I was just thinking that kind of parallels the wellness section of the paper today. And now for lifestyle. Take a walk and it'll improve your spirits. We see this happening. And of course, the biblical text talks about the destruction of creation, about an enormous climate catastrophe, the flood, and about the grief that such destruction creates for people like us who witnessed it. So in these reflections, I want to make these stories come alive in all of their social complexity, that we might realize the enduring nature of the consequences of sin and violence we grapple with. And if some of these stories sound familiar to those of you who have taken my courses, it's actually pretty much all new material. I've gone even deeper and differently into these stories than I have before. So every time I'm grappling with the text, I'm finding other things. A third thing these reflections do is broaden the topic. I was asked to write about women and the climate crisis. Now, one way to do that is to center the story of women who are suffering through similar crises in their own time. The women in the Noah story, for instance, his wife, Noah's wife, and the wives of his sons. They are mentioned, interestingly enough, almost as often as Noah is. And we are told just as much about them as we were told about Noah. That is, almost nothing. I mean, if you look at the text, you have God giving the commands to Noah, and Noah never talks back. And you have, the story of the flood, and then it's, Noah, his wife, his sons, and his sons' wives. And again, you get those, verses about all of them doing these things, all of them going into the ark, all of them coming out of the ark. So I thought, well, since we have like numerous explorations of Noah and Noah's response to this kind of stuff, even though we know almost nothing about Noah, in these reflections, I decided to explore the responses of Noah's wife and daughters-in-law. Did their role as women in a world of male violence cause them to react differently to this judgment? Did they grieve all that was lost? I mean, don't forget this text is centered in what comes right before the Noah flood are texts about the heroes and warriors of old, that is the warlords, right? So we know it was a world of male violence. So did they react differently? Did they grieve all that was lost? Did they have hopes that something new would come out of this catastrophic climate event? I think some of you probably know how difficult it is to have that kind of hope faced with catastrophe. So week 2 of the reflections explores the story of the women and the flood. Now, another story I center is the story of Ruth and Naomi, a story of climate refugees, vulnerable women facing the threat of male violence and connections to the land. These are all topics we wrestle with today. In some ways, it's easy to draw the connections between today and the story of Ruth. And that's week 3 of the reflections. And another series of stories is that of some women in the Gospels. Do their stories tell us anything about resilience in the face of loss? So these stories in the last week of reflections cover the whole arc of the gospel narrative, starting with Mary and ending with resurrection, engaging women who so deeply longed for healing and restoration, that boundaries are crossed, hope is grasped, love is poured out, and new life is seen. But I gotta say, as I wrestled through what I was gonna do with these 4 weeks, telling the stories of women didn't seem to be enough. There's also the story about our God, about that God that these women too image, about the creator God who calls this world into being, gives it life, upholds it with the spirit of creation, nurtures creation and us through sorrow and loss and hope. When I was in university, I'm going to give you some backstory to my thinking about this. I was told that we need to use male pronouns for God because God is more easily identified with men, and specifically with fathers, because God's relationship to creation was more distant, like a father's relationship to his child. And a father's relationship is more distant, this professor told me, than a mother's relationship to a child. I'm not making this up. This was actually what this professor said. Looking back, I'm like, really? How did he get away with this? Now, mind you, it was 1982, 83, somewhere around then. So a long time ago. But and his point was that unlike a mother who gives birth to a child and was therefore more deeply connected to her children, a father was separate, less involved, able to maintain the boundary between himself and his children. Now, obviously, the rather uptight man who taught me this, and I won't name any names here, but I can think of at least one person on this call who probably knows who it was. Obviously, he was trying to avoid something, a number of things probably. But besides the obvious fallacy about parental relationships, and let's be clear here, I think most of us would find this a really weird blanket statement. I don't think my emotional connection to my children is greater than that of my husband's. Actually, I'm a 5 on the Enneagram, so my emotional connection might be a little more distant, actually. And I don't have a lesser connection to my stepson than my other kids, even though I did not birth him. It's quite a thing to say. But this is also a misreading of the biblical text. First of all, in the ancient world, there were no other categories for thinking about God, right? You've got to take into account the context of who was writing the text. But even within those categories, the picture of God transgresses the boundaries of who was male. So God's deep love for creation, God's deep hope for creation's flourishing, the hope every parent has for their child, for their flourishing, God's deep grief for creation's destructions, God's tears and crying for creation when things go wrong, as we read in the prophets, God's commitment to bring resurrection and wipe away all tears. All of this speaks to a deep love and nurturing care for creation. Now, it's true that in the ancient world, the language of grief The task of lament and weeping was that of women. Women were the ones who grieved a loss. And this means that the biblical story does draw a picture of God that resonates with the role of women in the ancient world. And I just finished teaching a course where I explore that whole different reading of God in more depth. What I've tried to do in these reflections in the first week is I've tried to describe the nourishing and grieving character of God in order to draw a direct line with the nourishing and grieving character of the women in the stories that follow. So this is not to say that God is one gender over against another, but to say that all the years of gendering God as male has closed our eyes to the way that God's grief and nurture for creation should shape our calling as well. More than the idea of God's distance, which has resulted in such terrible misuse of creation. So this is what the stories are, for the most part, with the exception of one, are about in the first week of the study. And that sets up the rest of the study. So this is kind of how I thought my way through what the study looks like. A week focusing on God and who God is in the story. Because don't forget, this is the God we image. So we should have a good idea of who that God is. And then a week exploring the grief that the women of the flood felt through that climate catastrophe. And then a week exploring the climate refugee stories of Ruth and all the things that flow out of climate refugees in terms of hospitality, threats of violence towards women, loss of connection to the land, all of that. And then a last week that goes through the arc of the biblical the gospel stories, starting with Mary and her walk before the Magnificat, and ending with another Mary in the garden for resurrection. So that's the whole arc. What I'd like to do with you now is walk you through one of the devotions, just to give you an idea of what they're like. And this devotion is from the first week. It is from the Thursday of the first week. And what I'm going to do is just read it for you and give you a bit of the backstory, and then at the end of today's session, we'll actually be doing the prayer. We'll be closing the session with the prayer. All of the devotions begin with a Bible passage, and the day I've chosen actually only has one sentence for the Bible passage. Most of them are a bit longer, but let me give you the background for this day first. This is the Thursday of the second week, actually. It's the middle of the flood story, and it's a reflection on the women who find themselves in the ark, and I've already walked through in the previous day some of the different kinds of grief they might be experiencing as they see their whole world disappear. Some of you might resonate with that grief if you are in a part of Canada where there has been a flood recently, or where there's been fire, or if you are looking around, as I do when I go to my parents, and watching development inch ever closer to the river that you grew up on. So in the midst of that grief, where was hope? What connected these women to hope coming out of the ark? So the Bible reading for this day is Genesis 7, verse 24. And it's just a very short verse. And the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. Just imagine that, being in an ark. This is not part of the reflections. This is just me talking now off the top of my head. Imagine being in an ark for 150 days with all of these animals, and you're struggling with just a little bit of trauma, right? Imagine that, 150 days. So that's a long time. That's 5 months. So here's the reflection. And I don't know, maybe Suzanne, you could tell me, would it be good for me to maybe put the text up so people can read along? Do you think that would be good?
Sure, are you able to do that, Sylvia? Does Sylvia have
Oh,
co-hosting?
I can see. Oh, I need to be co-hosted.
Okay. Janice can do that, I think.
Mhm.
And again, just while Janice is doing that, a reminder to folks to please be welcome to put questions in the chat as they occur to you. And we will have a time for some conversation with Sylvia following her presentation. I think you can do it now.
Okay. This is the reflection for Thursday, December 8. Daily rhythms that nurture life. And the water swelled on the earth for 150 days. In the midst of their grief, their sorrow, their deep longing for the places and people they had lost, the women knew that being rooted in the earth meant caring for the creatures of the earth. In the midst of their own pain, they immersed themselves in the task at hand. Here they were united in feeding the hungry and binding up the broken creatures, cleaning out the spaces that had become home for the winged ones and the four-legged ones, seeking the lost and escaped before they were devoured by another creature. In this place, all were vulnerable, all needed to be served. Gradually, their sorrow was pierced by moments of joy. Death lay outside their walls, but birth soon began within. Shrill open mouths, small furry bodies, knock-kneed creatures stumbling for an udder, life exploding all around. With birth came knowledge. This is what each creature needs. This is what happens in the secret places of the forest, the edges of the meadow, the tops of the trees. This is what we lose when the forest disappears, when the hedgerows are cut down. Each day, their grief was held in acts of service and hope, in the deep daily rhythm of ensuring that life continued. They were fulfilling the ancient call to observe and serve creation, being called back to their true role as the servants of creation. The ark, then, was not only the place of safety and nurture that would make resurrection possible, the ark also as the place of learning to find out who we really were called to be. What I was trying to evoke in that particular reflection was just this sense of the ark as almost the place of apprenticeship, right? So where the women were called back to that first calling, where they learned everything that had been lost in all the violence of the earth, on the earth that preceded this story. And I'll say the prayer from that week at the end of our session here together today. But that just gives you an idea of kind of the flavor of the devotions and also the length. None of them are that long. Connections between the devotions and our own time. It's very hard in the 300 World Devotions to draw out those kind of connections, which is why I was very happy to be asked to also write a Bible study to go with the reflections. So each week there's a series of questions that invite further reflection on the text and what the implications are for our lives. So a little bit of further background is given in each study. And they try not just to give a deeper insight into the text and not just a deeper personal relationship between us and God, but also the on-the-ground communal implications of these stories. So the Bible studies are intended to be communally focused. You can do them, do them on your own. There's no problem with doing that. But I think there's something about doing them in a group that would be helpful for thinking, well, first of all, fruitfully. It's always, it's always better if you're talking about a biblical text with somebody, because you spark different things with each other. So it's, I think, better to do in a group. And if you don't have a current Bible study group, find a friend or two to meet with on the Friday of each week over lunch or dinner, in person or on Zoom, to talk through the implications of the devotions and the Bible study questions. I say a Friday because the Bible study assumes that you've read the whole week's worth of devotions. So you want to have read them all before you dive into the Bible study questions. So they're at the end of each week. Jen has worked very hard to link PWRDF partner stories with each devotion. I did not see those stories when I wrote the Bible study questions. Otherwise, I would have loved to have drawn connections in the Bible studies between the reflections that I did and the stories that Jen has put together. So that's a challenge I would throw out to you, add a question, add a question at the end of the Bible studies. How do these stories connect with the stories that you're reading about work that women are doing around the world? Do these biblical stories deepen your sense of God's work through these women? And do the things those women are doing, do those things deepen your reading of the biblical story? So see if that cross-fertilization can happen as well. I'll say one more thing and then I'll be finished. I think these Advent devotions might be a good counterpoint to our society's ramp up for Christmas, which is quite possibly the most creationally destructive holiday that we celebrate as a culture. So in the middle of the buying, especially the buying of the things that will just end up being landfill, in the middle of that, reflecting on these stories, I think, can center us and call us back to what are our priorities for this holiday? What is it to be faithful to both God, faithful to the story that we ground ourselves in, faithful to creation, and faithful to each other as we celebrate the birth of Jesus this year. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. It's really, really wonderful. And now this is, and I'll start from the beginning, Janice, a practical question to you about subscribing. Those who subscribed last year, do they need to subscribe again this year? Oh, and you said that, but.
Yeah, but that's okay. Just in case maybe not everybody's reading the chat. Yes, you do have to subscribe again. That's according to Canada's anti-spam legislation. When you sign up, you're only signing up for a specific thing. So we're not allowed to just roll you into the next year. So yes, and it is actually physically a separate list, as physical as something digital can be. Yes, please do that.
Okay, thanks. Marnie made a comment, and I don't know if you'd like to comment back, Sylvia, about one of the things that comes to me is how do we feed people and animals for 150 days on an ark? And as you evoke, it's more beings came out of the ark than went in, because of course there was a lot of birthing going on during that time. So I just don't know if you have any sort of thoughts of that, especially as a farmer with fluctuating numbers of animals on your farm and people too.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how deeply I go into this in I think the previous reflection. I mean, they were told to gather enough food and for all the animals for that length of time. I mean, the whole story for me particularly as a story written in an agrarian culture. Noah's family, but also the people hearing this story would have known how wildly improbable the whole thing would seem. For instance, as a farmer, a genetic pool of 2 is not going to get you very far in terms of ongoing fertility and biodiversity on the planet, right? So there's that, and then there's the logistics of enough food for all of these animals going forward, including taking into account that some of the animals on the ark were actually food for other animals on the ark, which obviously couldn't, if they were to continue to propagate, they couldn't be used as food on the ark. So there's just all kinds of interesting improbabilities in reading the story. What I like about that, though, is we ourselves, as we look at what's happening to the climate crisis, as we look at how overwhelming the problems are becoming, as the UN reports keep coming out saying, look, folks, we're passing tipping points, or, there's going to be no way to go forward. In the middle of all that, there are also the studies showing the small, improbable things that people are doing that are actually resulting in restoration, that are resulting in increased biodiversity in these places that seem, almost too small to have an effect. And I'm thinking here of, increasing permaculture farms in Africa. I'm thinking of places where they're greening the desert in China and in Jordan. I'm thinking of the places that are rewilding, and insect biodiversity is skyrocketing. And actually, we've seen this on our farm in the last couple of years. Just the rewilding planting that we've been doing, the pollinator planting, and I am seeing this year all these insects that just were not here 2 years ago, including some bees that are at risk. So that, that's, and I look around and think, this isn't an enormous space, the space we're rewilding. If a city block did this, the impact would be phenomenal. And so I think that's part of the takeaway from this story. There's this small, I'm cupping my hands, you can't see it, there it is, this small, improbable arc that's engaged in a preservation project that seems, against all the evidence, like it wouldn't work. And yet we're seeing in our world that those same kinds of small preservation projects that, against all the evidence, shouldn't really have that much difference, do. They do have an impact. And so I think about this in terms of creating arc spaces, right? What is it to create spaces that are arcs? There's a woman who's written a book that I haven't actually read yet called Refugia, but places of refuge, right, for creation in the midst of everything that's going around. And oddly enough, cities are very well poised to do this because, I live in the middle of farms, and what farmers do is they monocrop, they're cutting down tree lines. There are more threats to biodiversity in rural areas right now than in cities, because in cities, people have backyards, front yards, where they can plant a lot of different things. Now, when I'm driving through Toronto and Peterborough, even, I'm looking at the verges on streets that have grass between the sidewalk and the road. I'm looking at people's front lawns, and I'm just thinking, wow, if I had enough hours in my life to galvanize all these neighborhoods, to plant the front yards, to plant every bit of grass, we could turn around the insect collapse. And when we turn that around, then the bird collapse will be turned around, right? And suddenly the future will look incredibly, incredibly different. So So yeah, that question of having enough food, also the seeds for planting, they also had to take seed with them for planting when they came out of the ark. All of that seems like overwhelming, impossible work. And yet we're called to these little acts of daily faithfulness that in the end result in doing that overwhelming, impossible work a little bit at a time.